And welcome, hello. Welcome, hello to the class which I am gonna finally make that 20-minute target. I have cut a slide off every one of these presentations now. I will make it to 20 minutes. Key ships will be 20-minute videos. I will stop being a laughing stock of the people who say I cannot do a 20-minute video. But leave that to one side. Welcome to a video about what is possibly the class which have had the biggest impact on the world if they'd actually been built. Whether Francesco Caracciolo had entered service as an aircraft carrier, let's be honest, an Italian aircraft carrier would have been really, really interesting. Because she's actually launched, the Caracciolo. She's launched. Or, if the class entered service as capital ships, they would have had a massive knock-on effect. And I'm going to do something slightly different. Normally I put a question at the end of each video. And you might notice in some of the comments if you go back, some people choose to answer them, some people don't. I'm going to start off with a question at the beginning for this class. Two things. One, how does the world change if the Francesco Caracciolo is completed as an aircraft carrier? I have no doubt the Italians do a better job than the Bern. And if you heard some funny noises, that's me taking off my ankle strap because it's starting to itch. Yeah, my ankle is getting better, but it still needs to be strapped up at the moment. I'm told I should probably take this with me to Australia, although I probably shouldn't need it afterwards. Now, that first question, as said, is if it's completed as an aircraft carrier. But a second question is a more interesting one, because if for some reason, and I do expect someone to jump up at certain points, because every time I do an Italian ship or Italian subject, he hopes that his sister in Italy will end up watching the video and he'll be able to say hello to her. So the moment he hears I'm discussing an Italian class, he gets very, very, very amorous. Don't you? You get very, very affectionate. Because you want to be in the camera, so your sister can see you. She was his favourite sister. Anyway, leaving that to one side. Second question is, because last video of this series, I asked, what happens if the treaties? What do you think happens if the treaties don't get impacted till 1930s? Well, the other question is, what happens if the treaties don't include Italy and France? If Italy and France don't join? There is an argument for this, because let's be honest, this class was already under 35,000 tons. So frankly, they could have been ignored. And Italy could have signed up to this and could have built this class, and they would have probably had 4 of the best capital ships in the world. And France would have gone, our ships are terrible in comparison. And the Royal Navy would have gone, we have a problem here because these things can do 28 knots. And it would have changed Nelson and Rodney immediately, because if you've got 28 knot capital ships, 28 knot capital ships sitting in the Mediterranean, the Royal Navy is going to need to make very, very different decisions vis-a-vis the Queen Elizabeth class and their upgrades, and vis-a-vis the Nelson and Rodney in terms of their speed. You are going to see some very interesting changes happen, because the Royal Navy has to respond. 28 knot battleships means they can avoid combat with most of your battle fleet, and you haven't got the 3 to 4 knots you need advantage in speed in your battle cruisers to escape them and outmaneuver them. So 28 knot battleships have a big impact. And the moment the Royal Navy needs to adjust to deal with them, so does the US Navy, and need to adjust to deal with that, because the Japanese are going to want to adjust to deal with it. Because the Japanese, remember, want to build a fast battleship fleet. The Japanese are looking at fast battleships as their solution to their problem. The ships which are fast enough to fill in for them in a battle cruiser role, i.e. the information warfare, the economic warfare and the scouting warfare roles, while still being heavy enough to fight in the battle line. Shameless book plug. So, this is what we're talking about. A 28-knot battleship for the Mediterranean. The Francesco Caracciolo class. And we look at their original plans. The original plans authorized by Paolo van de Revel, who was the chief of staff at this time. And he was the admiral in charge of the navy this time. For Rear Admiral Eduardo Frati to pursue. Have 12 15-inch guns. And 20 26-inch guns. Those things, they felt, would have been frigging scary. 28 knots, 12 15-inch guns. It's basically your Nightmare Queen Elizabeth class on steroids. It's really not fun for anyone to fight with. Apart from maybe HMS Warspite, but that's because Warspite doesn't consider anything, any kind of fighting, not fun. Now, they are possible because Italy, like Japan, is plugged into the British maritime industry, and it's part of a wider sort of maritime industry sort of grouping. And again, remember, information doesn't go; it goes both ways. There are some interesting decisions made. They have 20 Yarrow boilers and 4 Parsons steam turbines, so that's a very British sort of setup. But this whole ship is orientated around fighting in the Mediterranean. It's orientated around dominating the Mediterranean. And the reason why it would have the impact on the British it would is because if you can control the Mediterranean, you can control the critical pipeline for the Royal Navy going east to west and west to east. I.e. the access to the Suez Canal and the fast route for their fleets to get out to the Far East and defend their power, their empire. So the British would have to watch this and respond to an extent. It would also be, it's only 4 ships, and honestly, I think if Caracciolo had entered service in, well, she's launched in 1920, so I have a feeling she would have been kitted out and probably commissioned about 1922. The rest of the class are all pursuing at a slightly slower pace. They're all roughly 1915. I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't launched till about 1921, 22. And I wouldn't be surprised if they weren't commissioned at a rate of... Because again, fitting out takes time. You can have the slipways to build the ships, but it's fitting out the ships. It takes time and it's complicated in a battle, in a warship. It's complicated. It requires a lot of very precise engineering and technology coming together. So in this case, I wouldn't be surprised if they had the last one ended service. It wasn't commissioned in 1926. I think they would have been commissioned in 1922, 1926 time. So I think you'd had 4 ships over those years. That has an impact on things. I honestly think if, it's amazing either way. If Caracciolo, the treaty system happens, and Caracciolo becomes an aircraft carrier, then you suddenly have the Italians having a pretty darn decent aircraft carrier design for the Mediterranean. Let's be honest, a 28-knot battleship. Well, if you consider the weight differential for a carrier, and the probable conversion of this, we could be talking a 28, 29 knot carrier, definitely. Maybe even a little bit faster. And it's going to be a big and powerful carrier. Not a massive air group, but enough to be really quite scary. And let me sort of look at the details of them. 11.9-inch belt. Not the thickest belt out there, but it's decent. 15.7 inches of armour on the turrets. Again, not the thickest, but decent. It's that 28 knots. Think about that in comparison to the N3s. If you don't have a treaty system, and these are still built, then the Royal and this one is commissioned when it's commissioned, then the Royal Navy might seriously have to reconsider what it's doing the N3s, not just because of the Key class and other vessels coming along that way from the Japanese, but the Italians. I think in one of these videos I've talked about perhaps you ending up with a fast battleship race where the race is to make the ships as fast as possible while still retaining their battleship status, with everyone racing to roughly 30-31 knots, which is probably the point where it will work out. That's a possibility. And these would have been part of that drive. A core part of it. These are a very balanced design, and they're very possible for the Regia Marina to do. It's one of those things that really typifies most of the post-World War I designs. Most navies are being conservative to an extent in what they're building, but not in a way that's going to build them a aggressive ship, but in a way which is going to give them a ship which has all the capabilities they need, but they can actually viably construct it. It's within their infrastructure limitations. The number 13 class from the Japanese, potentially not. But everything else is. So economics being equal, and honestly, at the rate they were built, they could have built these, I don't see them having any trouble doing that and getting these vessels done. They could have them in service. They could have all of that done. That's the advantage for them. That's the advantage for the Italians. That's the advantage for everyone. This is the really interesting thing about the treaty system, and I know I've said on other videos, 1920s, 1930s, I see a naval treaty by happening in 1930. Whether or not there's one in 1920. I see it happening by about 1930. But the fact is, these carriers, these capital ships, all of them, they can be built. In fact, there's almost more of a likelihood of them being built with the economic scenarios that do happen in the 1920s, because it's a way of a government providing employment and national pride. We always think about governments trying to stave off the far left in terms of economic crises in this period and the threat of communism, but there's also always the threat of fascism, the threat of the far right. And I don't mean the modern political phraseology where everyone who's on the right wing who you disagree with is called a fascist. No, I mean actual fascism. That's the threat. You can stave off both sides if you can provide employment and you can provide national pride. And launching battleships is a way of doing that. Building battleships is a way of doing that. Building warships in general is a way of doing that. But this can provide employment and pride. It's something Italy has. You can make a strong argument when it's commissioned that it's one of the most powerful ships in the world, because unlike Hood, it has armor, and a goodly amount of it. Doesn't go as fast as Hood, but it has the same firepower as Hood. Although there would be a debate over that. And that's the interesting thing. If we go back to this design, the Italians were worried about rate of fire and rate of targeting. Okay? In the Mediterranean and the Adriatic, they had noticed a campaign in World War II which had been far closer and far nastier. They expected far more swirling fights. They expected high-speed engagements. as such, when they were looking at their guns and designing their guns, they were looking in their industry and going, what can we produce that will suit this? That will enable us to turn these things around as quickly as we can. And they decided to go with a 40 cal, i.e., a 15-inch or 381mm 40 cal. Not a 42, as the Royal Navy has fitted their ships. Not a bigger gun in terms of length. They go with a 40. They go with something which is actually shorter. And you're probably going to go, what? Alex, it's 30 inches. It's 2.5 feet of the gun length. How much does that really affect things? It's seconds. But if you are thinking of high-speed engagements, getting those guns on target and blasting away, every second you cut down the time between your guns pointing on target and firing and you seeing the enemy is a second saved. And a second more chance that you get the first round in. And it is really interesting that this class is orientated so much around basically getting the first shot in. They are a truly intriguing development on the fast battleship practice. Because they are a fast battleship Mediterranean style. And this is another reason why I think they would have a very big impact. Because for the Royal Navy to respond to that, whilst keeping within the limitations, is going to require, if there are treaties, a lot of engineering skill. And the Royal Navy will want to respond to that. Because the Royal Navy might only be able to build 2 ships under the treaty, Nelson and Rodney, but they would want them to be capable enough to do the job they need to do. Which means guarantee access through the Mediterranean. And I'm fairly certain the Queen Elizabeth class would get a boiler upgrade as well. And an armour upgrade. Boiler and armour upgrade and going. So, yeah, Queen Elizabeth class can all do 28 knots now. I don't think Royal Oak would get the improvements. Historically, I don't think she would. I think they would just completely ignore the R class and just focus everything in on the Queen Elizabeth. That's my personal view. But how does America respond to the Queen Elizabeth class jumping up to probably a firm 27, maybe even 28 knots, but it's going to depend on what boilers and when they do the upgrades. Nelson and Rodney being 28 knots and the Royal Navy suddenly going, right, well, we have 7 capital ships which can do 28 knots. The Italians have 4. We have 3 capital ships, maybe Tigers even kept around instead of being sold off instead of sacrificed instead of an R, because again she can be made to be faster. We have these ships which can do 30 knots. It makes this appearance of this class and the position of geography, and remember, naval warfare is about geography. Their position in the Mediterranean means the Royal Navy has to respond. If the Royal Navy responds, that's going to affect their ship design. If it affects their ship design and their fleet orientation and their organisation of their fleet, it's going to have an impact on the Japanese. It's going to have an impact on the Americans, especially the Japanese, especially post the naval treaty, the Anglo-Japanese alliance going and the naval treaties being implemented. The relationship doesn't stay the same as it was. The Japanese start having to think about the British possibly being a threat. In that, not an abstract way, but in a realistic way. And it's a case of, ooh, alright, well you've got a faster fleet. We've been building our fleet to be faster than the Americans and give us the speed advantage so we can dictate battle to them and hopefully offset their numerical advantage with our ability to decide when to engage. But now we also have you who are faster than the Americans by a long way and probably as fast as we are. That becomes a problem for the Japanese. And it could start a speed race, even under treaty limits. Anyway, that's 20 minutes. Put in the questions. Hope you enjoyed. I'm going to try and keep these videos to 20 minutes. I will get them all done in 20 minutes. But now I'm in the admin section, so this is after 20 minutes. It's fine. It's fine. 20 minutes after it's admin. What have we got coming up? This will come out on, if I'm not mistaken, the 19th of May. 19th of May. Patron 79 was yesterday. How went? Well, not sure what it is yet. Still, when I'm recording this, it's currently suggestions still live. We've got Gunther Lunchen's Useful Idiot or Misunderstood Leadership next week. We've only got a few more lives. About 4 more lives till hopefully I'm off to Australia. 4 more lives. Fingers crossed we raised the money we needed. Fingers crossed. Thank you everyone for your support and thank you everyone for your kindness. Hope you enjoyed.